If she dies, who's paying me back? That's what my father said when I came to ask him for $15,000 to save my wife's life. It's been a year since that day, but those words are still burned into my memory. And from that moment on, I knew I no longer had a family. What made it even more bitter was when my grandmother lent me the $15,000. He showed up at the hospital to demand that money from her. Follow my story to understand why some children cannot walk away from their families. Hello everyone, my name is Qley. I'm 33 years old and live in the house my grandmother left me in a small town in Ohio. Before everything changed, I had a happy life with my wife, Megan. 5 years ago, Megan and I got married after nearly 2 years of dating. I was a construction engineer for a local building company, and she was a preschool teacher. Megan was a petite woman with a smile that always lit up the room and a heart wide open to every child. Every evening when she came home, she would tell me the sweetest stories about her students. Her voice was always full of warmth. In those moments, I felt like the luckiest man in the world. After a small wedding, we moved into a rental house in the suburbs. The house wasn't big, but it was our home. We would sit on the small front porch on weekends, sip coffee, and discuss our plans. Megan often said she wanted a child, and I liked that too. Our life back then was simple, but it was full of hope. But then, 4 years ago, everything turned upside down. During a shift at the construction site, the crane malfunctioned, and a steel beam fell directly on my left leg. The sound of my bones breaking and my scream still echoes in my head to this day. After 3 surgeries, the doctors did everything they could but couldn't fully fix the damage. With a heavy voice, Dr. Martinez told me, "Qley, you'll be able to walk again, but you'll limp for the rest of your life. And with this condition, you won't be able to continue working in construction." His words felt like a knife to the chest. On the day I was discharged, I looked down at the crutch in my hand, and it felt like I was staring into a dark, uncertain future. I had gone from being a strong man providing for his family to becoming a burden to my wife. The compensation from the company was only enough to cover the hospital bills and a few months of living expenses. After that, everything fell on Megan's shoulders. She had to work extra hours and take tutoring jobs on weekends to keep us going. Every time I saw her come home exhausted after a long day, it felt like my heart was being sliced open. At that time, we didn't have proper health insurance, we didn't own a home, and we had no real savings to fall back on. All we had was our love for each other and the hope that tomorrow would be better than today. But I never imagined that the very love we held onto would be the reason I lost Megan forever. After the accident and losing my job, we fought through each day, holding on to the hope of a brighter future. But fate struck us down once again. I remember that morning clearly. It was a Sunday exactly 1 year ago. I was jolted awake by a loud noise coming from the bathroom. Limping my way there to check, I found Megan collapsed on the floor, unconscious. Her body was shaking uncontrollably. I called 911 immediately. Those minutes of waiting for the ambulance felt like an eternity. I held Megan in my arms, her body burning with fever, while I trembled with fear. After a series of urgent tests at the hospital, Dr. Thompson pulled me into a private room. His face was serious as he said, "Qley, your wife has a brain aneurysm. It's hazardous, and we need to operate immediately." His words made my head spin. I looked at him and asked, "Doctor, can you save her?" He placed his hand on my shoulder to reassure me. "We'll do everything we can. But you need to understand this is a complicated surgery. The success rate is about 70%. You'll need to speak with the billing department to complete the paperwork before we can proceed." Seconds later, I rushed to the finance office. The woman there looked at Megan's file and said, "Qley, to proceed with the surgery, the hospital requires a $15,000 deposit." Hearing that amount hit me like lightning. $15,000 was a mountain compared to our situation. At the time, all we had in savings was $1,200. I stood there frozen, my mind spinning. I knew if I couldn't come up with that money immediately, Megan would die. The hospital policy was clear. No deposit, no surgery. And time was slipping away. Megan's condition could worsen at any moment. I realized I had only one option. I had to get that money no matter what it took. When I left the finance office, Megan had regained consciousness, though she was extremely weak. With a raspy voice, she held my hand and said, "I'm scared, Qley." I forced a smile and tried to comfort her. "Don't be scared. I'll take care of everything. You rest." But inside I was terrified. I knew there was no easy way to gather $15,000 in just a few hours. At that moment, only one thought filled my mind. There was only one place I could turn to. My family, my parents. Even though they had no obligation to help, I had no choice. After the accident, Megan's family had done everything they could to support us. But now I couldn't ask for more. Her parents, Arthur and Helen, were both retired and struggling to get by. I knew they couldn't help this time. So, after standing silently for a few minutes in the hospital hallway, I called Megan's parents. I told them what had happened and asked them to stay with her while I returned to the house I grew up in. Despite all the hesitation in my heart, that was the last door I had left to knock on. The only one I could turn to for help. That afternoon, I drove to my parents' house with my heart pounding. The feeling was both familiar and painful. It had been 3 years since I last came here asking for help. That visit ended with me walking away, my throat tight with disappointment. Back then, I had just had an accident, couldn't work anymore, and needed some support to cover medical bills. But they turned me away without a single ounce of sympathy. Coming back this time, I knew I was gambling. But I still carried a faint hope that in this life or death situation, my parents would find it in their hearts to help. When I walked in, my mother, Ruth, was sitting in the living room, eyes glued to the TV screen. She looked up, surprised and a little wary, and asked, "Corey, what are you doing here at this hour?" Before I could answer, footsteps echoed from the kitchen. My father, Ralph, appeared, and his eyes immediately hardened when he saw me. With a dry voice, as if filling the silence, he asked, "What is it?" Trying to steady my voice, I explained briefly about Megan's condition, the upcoming surgery, and the amount we needed. Then I looked straight at my father and said, with all the desperation I had, "I know it's a lot of money, but this is my wife's life. I'm begging you, please help me just this once." The room fell silent. Ralph didn't answer right away. Then, in a flat tone that sounded more like a sentence than a response, he said, "We don't have the money. You have your own family now, so take care of it. Go get a loan if you need to." Hearing those words felt like having a bucket of cold water thrown in my face. My heart clenched. I couldn't tell if it hurt more because it was cruel or I had already expected it. Still, I tried one last time. With a voice that cracked, I raised it a little and said, "Dad, this is my wife. Can't let her die." He hesitated for a few seconds, then said plainly, "If she dies, who's paying me back?" I stood frozen. My ears rang from what I had just heard. I couldn't believe those were the words my father chose to say. Just then, my younger sister Scarlett came down the stairs with a curious look. She caught part of the conversation, and with an unfiltered sarcastic tone, she shrugged and said, "Dad's right. If she dies, how are you going to pay him back? We're not exactly rich, you know." At that moment, I turned and looked at her. This was the same little girl I once carried in my arms, the one I used to protect when bullies picked on her at school. Now, she was speaking about my wife's possible death like it was some grocery store mistake. I couldn't say a word in response. As the air grew heavier, my mother stood up. With rare firmness in her voice, she looked at my father and said, "Give him the money. I'll pay it back." Ralph turned sharply toward her, his eyes blazing, and snapped, "Don't get involved in this. What do you know about money?" Her shoulders trembled with anger. Then she replied, each word forced through clenched teeth, "If you don't help him, I'll file for divorce." That sentence struck all of us like a thunderclap. Ralph's face turned red. His lips pressed together until they were pale. I stood still like a statue, not out of shock, but because, for the first time, I felt like my mother was trying to stand up for me. And it would be the last time I wanted her to be caught in the middle like that. I took a deep breath, then slowly stood up. Looking at her with gratitude and pain in my eyes, I said quietly, "I understand. I don't want you to carry this burden. I'll figure it out myself." Then I turned to my father and Scarlett. My voice was shaky but firm as I spoke every word clearly. I used to think that no matter what, this was still my home. But now I see, a home isn't a place that turns its back on you when you need it most. I walked out the door, leaving a room full of silence and tension. As the door closed behind me, I could hear shouting erupt inside, loud and bitter. But I didn't look back. In just a few minutes, the last thread of hope I had for this family snapped. And I knew then, more than ever, that I was truly on my own in the fight to save the only woman who had never once abandoned me. When I returned to the hospital, it was already 3 in the afternoon. Every step I took felt like dragging my feet through cold, heavy mud. My whole body ached. My mind was blank. As I approached the recovery unit, I was surprised to see Megan's parents, Arthur and Helen, sitting on the waiting room bench. Both of them looked pale from exhaustion and worry. The moment Arthur saw me, he spoke gently. "We already know. The doctor just spoke with us. It's a lot of money, but if we have to, we'll mortgage the house." Right after he said that, Helen reached out and held my hand. Her eyes were filled with quiet understanding. With a slow and steady voice, she added, "We can't come up with it right away, but we'll borrow what we can. We'll do whatever it takes." As soon as she finished, my throat tightened. I couldn't get a single word out. I just nodded. I knew they had already given all they could, and I understood. I had no right to ask more from two people who had spent their lives raising their daughter with patience and kindness. After they stepped away to speak with the doctors again, I sank into a hallway chair, pulled out my phone, and started scrolling through my contacts. A few names came up, then passed by. Old co-workers, former classmates, some people I used to know from the job site, but I had no idea who I could call. I didn't even know what to say. While I was still hesitating, my phone buzzed. A notification lit up the screen. A deposit had just been made, $15,000. I froze. My hand stopped midair. I opened the banking app. No note, just one brief message. Credited $15,000. Still stunned, before I could react, my phone rang again. The caller ID made my heart stop. My grandmother Sylvia was the woman who had spent her entire life caring for our family. She lived alone now, and I knew her finances were tight. There was no way she should have been able to send that kind of money. I picked up right away, my heart pounding. Before I could speak, her voice came through the line, calm and clear. "I just transferred $15,000 to you. If that's not enough, please tell me. I'll send more." My nose burned. I had to take a deep breath to find my voice. A few seconds later, with my words breaking in my throat, I asked, "How did you know?" She answered slowly, her tone heavy, "Your mother called me. She was crying while she told me everything." I've never heard her cry like that in my life. I knew she had no other choice. "Keep the money. You don't need to pay me back." After she said that, I couldn't speak anymore. Everything inside me, exhaustion, sorrow, gratitude, came crashing down in one long, silent sob. I don't even remember what I said to her after that. Maybe I just repeated "thank you" and "I'm sorry" repeatedly through my tears. It wasn't until much later that I learned the whole truth. That money was everything she had left. Her entire savings, her funeral fund, her retirement money, and she sold the wedding ring she had worn for 60 years, the last keepsake she had never taken off. And she gave all of it to me, to save the life of my wife, at the lowest point in my life. The next morning, as I stood at the front desk completing the paperwork for Megan's surgery, I heard hurried footsteps pounding behind me. The sound was sharp and heavy, like a storm rolling in. When I turned around, I saw Ralph storming toward me, his face flushed red with anger. Scarlett followed closely behind, arms crossed, her gaze cold as ice. The moment they stopped in front of me, Ralph spoke first, his voice laced with bitterness. "Sylvia just called. What did you say to make her call me a worthless failure who doesn't deserve to be a father?" He clenched his jaw and pressed each word through his teeth. "You standing there enjoying this?" I stayed silent, not because I was afraid but because I knew that the truth had never meant anything to people like them. Then Scarlett stepped forward. Her voice was sharp and cruel as she spoke. "Do you even know where that money came from? That was her funeral fund. The money she planned to share with the whole family. You took it all. What if your wife dies anyway? Who's going to give that back to her?" I looked straight into her eyes. My voice was calm but clear. "She gave that money to me on her own. She knew my wife needed surgery, and she still chose to help. But you knew that too, and you still came here to say this?" Scarlett pressed her lips together, her eyes flickering. But she didn't move. She stood there like she was waiting for me to break. At that moment, Ralph jabbed a finger toward my face and exploded. "Because of you, your mother had the nerve to talk back to me. She slammed the table. She threatened divorce. This whole house is in chaos because of you. Are you happy now?" I took a few seconds, pushing everything down inside me, then looked him in the eye and said, "My wife is in the hospital, fighting for her life. Neither of you came to check on her. Not a single word of concern. But the second you heard about money, you both rushed here to place blame." Right after that, I turned to the receptionist. My voice was calm and steady. "Please call security for me. These two have no business being here." As I turned back, Ralph roared from behind me, "You think you can throw me out? I kept walking without turning around. And with a firm voice, I said, I'm not throwing you out. I'm choosing who gets to be part of my life. A few minutes later, 2 security guards arrived. They were polite but firm as they escorted Ralph and Scarlett out of the area. Scarlett protested. Ralph muttered curses under his breath. And after everything, from that moment on, I knew none of them had any place left in my life. Strangely enough, that realization gave me more peace than anything else. With $15,000 in hand, I completed all the paperwork. Megan's surgery was scheduled for later that same afternoon. As the nurses wheeled her toward the operating room, I held her hand tightly. With a weak voice but still trying to smile, Megan looked at me and whispered, Qley, I love you. Right then, I leaned down and kissed her forehead, holding back tears as I said, I love you too. You're going to be okay. I'll be right here waiting for you. After those words, the doors to the operating room closed, leaving me alone in the quiet hallway. I sat in the waiting area, feeling like time had stopped entirely. The surgery began shortly after, and for 5 long hours I sat counting every second. Megan's parents came and sat beside me, but none of us said a word. We were all lost in our thoughts, silently praying for a miracle. At 11 o'clock that night, the doors to the operating room opened. Dr. Thompson stepped out. His face was exhausted, and his eyes could not hide the disappointment. The moment I saw his expression, I already knew. With a heavy voice filled with regret, Dr. Thompson looked at me and said, Qley, I'm very sorry. Technically, the surgery was a success. We repaired the aneurysm. But when we removed the clamp, the bleeding came too fast and too severe. We did everything we could, but we couldn't save her. At that moment, it felt like my entire world collapsed inside me. There was no screaming, no crying, only a crushing silence surrounded me. I sat there, staring at the doctor as if he had just spoken a language I couldn't understand. A few seconds later, my voice hoarse, I asked, Can I see her? Dr. Thompson nodded and led me into the room. I saw Megan lying there as if she were simply asleep. Her face was peaceful, untouched by pain. I sat beside her and held her hand, now cold. Right then, I leaned in and whispered into her ear, You fought so hard. Now you can rest. I will remember you forever. At that moment, holding her hand one last time, the woman who had been by my side just yesterday was suddenly gone. I don't remember how long I sat with her after that. All I know is that I was no longer the same person when I finally stood up and walked out of that room. I was a man with no wife, no hope, and soon no family. The funeral took place 3 days later. Megan lay peacefully in an oak casket, surrounded by white flowers and the soft flicker of yellow candlelight. Her parents stood nearby, their eyes swollen and red from many sleepless nights. When word spread about our sudden loss, a large number of people came to pay their final respects. There were relatives from both sides, friends of Megan, some of my former co-workers, and to my surprise, Ralph came. Scarlett came too. Even a few relatives from my father's side whom I thought I'd never see again. As I was walking back from seeing off a few guests, I heard Ralph's voice behind me. He didn't speak loudly, but his words were sharp and clear enough to silence the entire room. With a stern face and a tone laced with condescension, he said, I don't want to say this here, but everyone should know. Qley manipulated my mother, Sylvia, into giving him all the money she had saved for her funeral. And then his wife died anyway. At that moment, I stood frozen. Every eye in the room turned toward me. Just then, my mother, Ruth, stood up. Her eyes were red and full of pain. With a trembling voice, she turned to her husband and said, Stop it. Our son just lost his wife. What more do you want from him? After everything, I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. Not for myself, but for the woman who had just passed. A few seconds later, I lifted my head and looked straight at Ralph. My voice was steady, slow, but firm. When Megan was in the hospital, her family was ready to mortgage their house to save her. And you? What did you say when I begged you for help? I didn't stop there. My eyes locked on him. You told me if my wife died, who would pay you back? Then I paused for a moment, pointed at Scarlett, and continued, This woman agreed with you. And when my mother pleaded with you, you shouted in her face. The room grew tense. You could feel it in the air, tight like a pulled string. Some guests glanced at each other. Others turned their eyes to Ralph and Scarlett, uncertainty spreading across their faces. Then, like thunder breaking through the rain, my grandmother Sylvia's voice rang out. She stepped forward slowly, leaning on her cane. Her tone was sharp and unwavering as she pointed at Ralph and roared, "That was my money. I gave it. No one begged. No one tricked me." The room fell into stillness. She paused for a moment, then with eyes burning bright, she looked directly at my father and said, "You have no right to talk about that money. You have no right to speak on it. I helped my grandson because I chose to, because I love him. And you're my son. But when he needed you most, you turned your back." At that moment, Ralph lowered his head. Scarlett stood frozen in place. Neither of them had anything left to say. Not a word of defense came after my grandmother's words, as sharp and cutting as glass. And I stood there, feeling a weight lift from my chest as if someone had finally spoken the truth I had carried silently for so long. From that moment on, her words drew a clear line between love and pretense. It changed how people looked at me and how they looked at my family. And ever since that day, nothing has been the same. That night, after all the mourners had gone, I sat alone on the back steps of the funeral home. My heart felt hollow after the enormous loss that had torn through my life. A few minutes later, I heard a cane tapping slowly along the hallway behind me. My grandmother walked toward me, took her time and sat beside me. Just when I thought she wouldn't say anything, she spoke in a soft but steady voice. Today didn't have to turn out this way. I turned to look at her. She kept her eyes fixed on the yard in front of us. Though time had dimmed her vision, her gaze was sharper than anyone I had ever known. Before I could ask her anything, she continued, her tone calm as if recalling a story long buried. "Did you know? Years ago, I told your mother she should get a divorce?" Those words hit me hard. My heart seemed to skip a beat. A few seconds passed before she went on. "I knew how Ralph was. Stubborn. Controlling. He cared more about appearances than the happiness of his own family. Your mother was only 38 back then. She still wanted to learn painting. She dreamed of opening a small flower shop. But he crushed all of it. And I told her to leave him. But she didn't. She was afraid your kids would grow up without a father. Afraid of what the relatives would say. She was afraid. And she chose to stay." Hearing that, I lowered my head. My mother had spent years standing in his shadow, caring for everything like the perfect homemaker. I had no idea the woman who stood up for me that day had dreams she never got to chase. After a moment, my grandmother placed her hand gently on the back of mine. Her voice softened like a hand reaching out in the dark. "The day you came asking for help, Ruth called me. She cried so hard she couldn't even speak. And I knew, if your mother had reached the point of calling me, things were already at the end of the line." At that moment, I didn't understand why a grown man like me could feel so fragile. My chest tightened with pain. Not from guilt or shame, but because I realized my mother had trusted the right person. Then my grandmother's voice turned firm, steady as stone, and that was when I knew. If I didn't stand with you, I would never forgive myself for the rest of my life. I couldn't hold it back any longer. I broke down, crying like a child. The tears streamed down quietly, but each seemed to loosen a chain around my heart. Then she whispered, "I don't have much time left, but if there's one thing you still believe in, let it be this. You were not wrong to love. You were not wrong to care. The ones who were wrong are the ones who turned away when they should have stood beside you." I didn't respond. I just nodded. Slowly, that night, between her and me, a part of the past that we had both hidden finally surfaced. And from that moment on, I began to learn how to forgive. Not for them, but for myself. 2 weeks after the funeral, I received a call from my grandmother. As soon as I picked up, she spoke with a calm but firm voice. "Are you free this afternoon? I need you to be present while I care for one last thing." A few hours later, I arrived at her small house, where I had spent many childhood summers. The air still carried the scent of old wood and homemade cookies. When I entered the living room, I saw a stranger sitting in a suit, a leather briefcase beside him. On the table was a thick folder and a small video camera being set up. At that moment, my grandmother came out of her room, leaning on her cane, her eyes locked on mine. Without leaving space for hesitation, she said, "Today, I'm revising my will, and I want you to witness it." I didn't ask why. I didn't question anything. I nodded. As she sat, the lawyer opened his notes, started the camera, and began the formal process. My grandmother listened silently. When he finished reading, she lifted her head, looked straight into the lens and said, "My name is Sylvia Hayes. Today, I am revising my entire will in a clear and sound state of mind, without any pressure from anyone. I am leaving my entire estate to my grandson, Qley Hayes, the son of Ruth and Ralph. This includes the home I currently live in at 1129 Fairfax Village, valued at approximately $200,000, a savings account containing $50,000, and additional assets including jewelry, antiques, and minor investment holdings worth around $50,000. I leave it all to Qley because he was the only one who never turned his back on me while I was alive. After taking a breath with unwavering eyes, she continued, I also state clearly that if Qley, for any reason, gives or shares any part of this inheritance with Ralph Hayes, Ruth Hayes, or Scarlett Hayes, this entire will is to be considered null and void. Once the recording was stopped, my grandmother turned to me. Her voice softened, but her gaze remained steady. You don't need to thank me. Just live right. And don't forgive too easily what doesn't deserve forgiveness. I didn't respond. I bowed my head and nodded. I could feel that afternoon in that small room with a camera, a legal document, and an older woman a generation had passed down to me not just wealth but a duty. To live with kindness, but not weakness. And for the first time, I felt I wasn't just someone who had been forgiven. I was someone chosen to make things right. 3 days after my grandmother revised her will, my mother asked to meet me at a small cafe outside of town. It was the first time I had ever seen her arrive alone. She wasn't standing behind Ralph anymore. She wasn't silent in every conversation. As soon as she sat down, she looked at me and spoke in a quiet but clear voice. You know, I filed for divorce this morning. At that moment, I looked up. Her eyes didn't flinch. She was no longer the woman who hesitated before speaking. With both hands wrapped around her steaming cup of coffee, she continued, I once wanted to study interior design, but your father said it was pointless. I wanted to go back to work after Scarlett was born. He told me staying home was the right thing to do. For so many years, I lived like someone else's dream was my duty. I didn't know what to say. I gently squeezed her hand as if to say, I'm listening. A few seconds later, her voice trembled slightly, but her words were firm. Your grandmother did something I never dared to do. She stood up. She chose not to stay silent. And me, I'm just too tired of enduring. After that, she reached into her bag and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. It was a registration form for an interior design class at the local community center. As she slid the paper across the table to me, her eyes lit up, shy but hopeful, and she gave a small smile. You know, I still have enough time to start over. I smiled. Not because it was easy, but because something inside me softened. For the first time, my mother didn't say, I have to. She said, I want to. In that moment, I saw her not as the mother who had always sacrificed, but as a woman who had just rescued herself from years of silent surrender. I had a feeling that her choice, to walk away from a loveless marriage and bravely begin again, would not only change her life, it would help me believe something too, that even when everything falls apart, we still have the right to begin again. From the start, lighter and freer. For months after Megan passed away, my grandmother followed her. Since then, I've been living in the house she left behind. A small place with a weathered wooden porch and a backyard full of lavender that she had tended to in the final years of her life. After she passed, I took care of the funeral arrangements myself. That day, only my mother and a few relatives came. Ralph and Scarlett did not attend. I remember one relative tried calling them, and they said, she's got nothing to do with us. Right after the service, I returned home and sat on the porch in the old rocking chair, looking out over the purple blooms swaying in the breeze. I remembered something she once said to me, when I asked her why she left everything to me. Not just the money, but her trust. She looked me in the eye and said, because you never asked for anything. But when it mattered most, you didn't walk away. At that moment, I understood. Some relationships we don't choose, but we're bound to them anyway. And others, the ones we least expect, can be the very thing that saves us. After divorcing Ralph, my mother moved to a small town over 30 miles from where I live. She takes night classes in interior design and works during the day at a furniture shop. Every weekend, she sends me a photo, a corner of a desk she designed, a hand-painted card, or sometimes just the coffee she's drinking on a quiet Sunday morning. Scarlett hasn't reached out. Neither has Ralph. But I heard he's being treated for late-stage liver cancer. The money from the house he sold after the divorce is already gone. Maybe that's karma. Some relatives have suggested I visit him. After all, he is my father. But I told them, my father died the day he refused to lend me $15,000. And I believe that some distances don't need to be closed. Sometimes, silence is the last respect we can offer each other. Megan's parents still visit me from time to time. We work on the garden together, adding a new row of flowers beside Sylvia's lavender. We don't say much, and I don't need them to. Each handshake, each hug, that's enough to know we are still a family in a way that doesn't need blood or paperwork to prove it. And that, right there, is enough to keep me going. A life without Megan, but still a life worth living. I'm sharing this story not to ask for pity. I'm sharing it to say that sometimes the hardest part isn't the loss itself. It's learning how to keep living after it. When the person you loved most is gone. When your family is no longer a place to return to. When the last line gets crossed, you must learn how to accept it. And before I end this story, I want to ask you, the person who stayed with me through every word and memory until this very moment, was I wrong to take my grandmother's entire savings, her wedding ring, and her funeral fund to save the person I loved without asking anyone's permission? I hope you'll share your thoughts in the comments below. If you've ever faced painful limits within your family, I'd also like to hear your story. If anything I've said resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. I'll keep sharing stories about family, healing, and setting boundaries, not to shut others out, but to protect who we are. Thank you for listening to me all the way through. And if you're in the middle of your storm right now, please remember this. You are not alone. Wishing you a peaceful day.